Signs. Signs are everywhere. But what exactly do they tell us? And why do we have them in the first place? This pedestrian crossing sign, for example, is the color yellow. Is that important to know? And what exactly would be the consequences if I didn't follow this sign? Some signs tell me clearly what I can and cannot do. For example, this sign tells me that I must stop, and we recognize by its red color that there may be some consequence if I choose not to follow this sign. Of course, this sign also is for my benefit. I must stop here, but it's also a good idea because I might hit a car coming toward me, or even a pedestrian crossing in front of this sign. In many ways, this discussion of signs is reflective of the bigger issue of the nature of language. How did language begin? And how did the rules that govern it come to be defined? Did these rules always exist? Or were they largely the creation of people to help make sense of the language they were using? Did they emerge to reflect the reality of the world around us? Or were they created to help provide order? Think of this no fishing sign. Is there a risk or danger if we try to fish in this pond? Or was the sign placed here solely to protect the interest of the owner? These two signs say exactly the same thing in English and in Spanish. But do they say it in the exact same way? Do these words even follow a similar organization? Some signs, of course, are not regulatory in nature. Some just give us helpful information. Of course, it's important to follow these signs, but is there a consequence for not following them? Again, this is an interesting point when it comes to discussing language. Today in part 1 of our video series, we are going to begin by thinking about these rules of language, and how they are formed, and why they might be so important to us. And hopefully, you won't be looking for this sign before the end of this video. Welcome to an introduction to grammar. So what is grammar? When many of us think of grammar, we often think about the identity of individual words or groups of words, referred to as parts of speech. We will be referring to those ideas as form. Many of us also think about grammar as referring to the relationships between words or group of words, and how, of course, they all interact. We will refer to this concept as the idea of function. Now, speaking of these relationships a little more clearly, these relationships are defined largely by two concepts. These are sort of like tests that we can think of applying every time we look at the relationship between words in a sentence. First off, we need to ask ourselves about the location. Where exactly are these words or ideas in relation to each other in the sentence? Another test we always need to apply is it logical for these words to actually interact? Oftentimes this is where our grammatical mistakes occur, is that the particular ideas we have together don't seem logical. Now, as we mentioned at the top of this video, there are certainly different ways to look at language. One, of course, is thinking about the idea of following rules. So many of us, when we think of the idea of grammar, we kind of think of the idea that there is somehow a good grammar that we need to follow versus things that we want to avoid, or a bad grammar. Now, this brings up an interesting idea when it comes to looking at the two different perspectives that people largely have when it comes to grammar. Much like we discussed earlier with regulatory signs, such as stop signs or no parking signs, this is a kind of a concept in which grammar is viewed prescriptively, where people think of grammar as largely based in rules, and that we have to master these rules in order to have good grammar. So, in some ways, people kind of refer to this as standard English. Of course, another way to look at grammar would also be to look at largely how people use grammar. not necessarily focusing on whether it's right or wrong, but kind of thinking about the context where the grammar is introduced. So think of this in a way as kind of a cautionary sign, much as you might see a yield sign or a pedestrian crossing sign. Well, this particular view is kind of the descriptive view, in which there may be multiple grammars depending on the context where you're using them. So, for example, standard English is still something important to learn, but it's something we would use largely in formal situations. Whereas a more street version of English would be important, but mostly in informal situations, and would not be viewed necessarily as a bad grammatical structure, only as appropriate for these kinds of situations. So let's begin at the beginning, so to speak, and begin to talk about the parts of speech. The parts of speech can be represented by individual words or groups of words. There are many parts of speech, which can be generally categorized into two groups. So at the word level, we kind of refer to the words that have meaning by themselves as content words. Other words we refer to as structure or support words, because these words largely exist to support or provide structure to the content words in the sentence. Now, in this series, we're going to refer to content words as major parts of speech. And then structure words we're going to refer to as, you guessed it, minor parts of speech. In our first video, we're going to concentrate more on the major parts of speech. Again, these words typically contain meaning on their own or by themselves. Each major part of speech has its own set of rules and ideas, and we must understand these at their most basic level before we can ever hope to move on to more complex grammatical ideas. Here we have a sample sentence that we're going to use that will demonstrate the major parts of speech that we're going to talk about in this video. Let's take a look at it. The brown fox jumped over the lazy dog quickly. So the first idea we're going to look at are called nouns. Again, nouns generally refer to people, places, things, or ideas. So in our sample sentence, the words fox and dog would be considered nouns. Other examples might be the word doctor, university, dog, car, and even the concept of love. These are all nouns. How do we know they're nouns? Well, another way to think about it is to think of this little short sentence. A noun is anything you can talk about. Can you talk about a university? Then a university is a noun. Can you talk about a dog? Then a dog is a noun. Can you talk about love? You guessed it, love would be a noun. So, now that we've identified the nouns, let's move on to identify the verb in the sentence. Again, a verb can be an action word or a state of being word. Well, in our example here, the verb is the word jumped. So verbs help provide action to a sentence, or tell us the state of being of the particular idea, such as the noun in the sentence. So for example, the word jump, or sing, or even the words is, are, or seem are all considered verbs. So again, an easy way to remember this is to think that a verb is anything a noun can do or be. A noun can jump. A noun can sing. For example, this person can jump, and this bird can sing. This bird is, for example, it is blue. All of these words would be considered verbs. Now that we've identified the nouns and the verbs in the sentence, let's move on to the concept of an adjective. Again, an adjective is an idea that mainly describes the noun in a sentence. In this case, we actually have two adjectives. Brown, as in the brown fox, and the word lazy, the word lazy dog. So adjectives describe nouns, and they provide some extra quality to the noun. For example, they could describe the color of the noun. They could describe the size of the noun, or perhaps even the condition or feeling of the noun. So, an adjective is how a noun looks, feels, or is. The final category we're going to look at is adverbs. Now, you'll notice that we have not identified every word in this sentence, but we have identified the three of the most important: the nouns, the verb, and the adjectives. Most of the time, adverbs can be found around the end of the sentence. So in this case, we have to think about, with the words I have remaining, the word quickly describes how the fox jumped. This would be the adverb. So again, adverbs help to modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. Adverbs are very flexible and can be found in many different places in the sentence. For example, adverbs such as quickly, really quickly, or even very, as in describing very tired. All of these examples would be considered adverbs. So for example, if I say the man runs quickly, quickly is an adverb, describing how he runs. In my second picture with the dog is running quickly, but we want to add some extra information. How quickly? Really quickly. And of course, tired is an adjective because it describes how the person is. He is tired. But the word very helps add an extra dimension to the idea. So again, adverbs help describe how is or how much is a verb, adjective, or adverb. So let's look at the first steps of the idea of form. For example, the nouns in this sentence were animals, which would belong to the things part of our list of people, places, things, and ideas. The verb in this sentence would be classified as an action verb. The verb jumped. The two adjectives, and this is usually the case with adjectives, help provide more information about the two nouns in the sentence. So for example, it's not just any fox, but it's a brown fox. And it's not just any dog, but it's a lazy dog. Finally, the adverb in the sentence, of course, described how the verb was done. So it jumped, but it jumped quickly. When we discuss the function of these ideas, again, focusing on the interaction, one of the first things we really need to pay attention to involves where the words are located in relation to the other words in the sentence. So again, noticing that the words we've highlighted here, let's pay particular attention to where the words are in relation to other words. So for example, let's start with the most essential relationship in language, and that is of nouns and verbs. So notice how one of the nouns in the sentence comes before the main verb in the sentence. So again, fox comes before the word jumped. This is describing the action that the fox performed. Notice how the adjectives in the sentence come before the nouns they're describing. So for example, brown and lazy are describing the words that come after them. Finally, notice how the adverb comes at the end of the sentence, even though it is modifying the main verb of the sentence. And again, modify is just another word to say describe. So in this case, the adverb quickly is actually kind of far away from the verb that it's modifying. These are important things to pay attention to, and these are things that we will explore in detail in our next video. So, location, location, location. This is essential to understand when it comes to the idea of grammar, because this is a visual way that helps to show how words relate to each other. So we need to understand these rules governing the locations of these words so that we can truly understand how these words relate. The most important thing to remember is that every word in a sentence has a grammatical purpose. So that means at least they're going to maintain one relationship with another word or idea in the sentence. And in fact, they may have several other relationships in the sentence. So, in conclusion, what is grammar? Well, the best way to think about it is grammar is sort of like the road signs of language. Much like with the road signs we see every day, grammar helps provide a structure to our lives, even if we don't always notice the benefits. Grammar is a natural product of language, but many of the rules that we have are also human-made. Again, some people see grammar as regulatory in nature, much like the signs you see here on the right side of the screen. In other words, rules that must be obeyed, or negative consequences will definitely follow. For example, misunderstanding or confusion, or perhaps even worse, a loss of respect from the person who's listening to you, thinking that you don't speak good English. But other people think of the rules of grammar as cautionary in nature, perhaps warning us, a strong suggestion perhaps, and certainly good ideas for our benefit. But of course they could also contain possible negative consequences if we choose not to follow them. Now, even though we don't have a grammar police in real life to enforce these rules, or even to give us a ticket when we break them, learning these rules is clearly going to be to your benefit if you want to have any chance to understand more complex grammatical ideas in the future. See you next time for Part 2, Solving the Puzzle. Thanks for watching.